The Power of Purity Conference will empower you to control sex instead of being controlled by sex. 100% anonymous, 100% confidential, 100% safe. The Power of Purity Conference.
Welcome to the Power of Purity podcast, the show that empowers men to experience their sexual gift in a healthier way. Now here's your host, Tony Ingrassia.
Hey guys, welcome back to the Power of Purity podcast. I'm glad you could join me today. And as always, I hope and I pray that listening to this podcast will be a blessing to you. And I'd like to start the episode today really by asking you for two favors. And the first one is this: if this podcast has been a blessing to you, if it's been helpful or encouraging in any way, would you consider the possibility of telling a friend about it? You know, we both know that this issue of sex is a big issue for many men, something that so many guys struggle with. And I believe that sexual brokenness represents the deepest brokenness and the deepest shame in so many people's hearts and lives. And there's just so many people struggling with this. They don't know where to go to get some help, some information, some encouragement. And so I'm just hopeful that the outreach of the podcast will continue to increase. I'm pleased, as young as the podcast is, how it's already escalating. But I just believe there needs to be hundreds and hundreds of people listening to this, and then thousands, and then hundreds of thousands, and then millions. And I'm not presuming, but I just believe that the need is so great, and we need to get the word out. You know, I used to be in the remodeling business for many years, and we believed and experienced that the very best lead that we could get in the business was what's called a referral. There's no better lead than a referral, because a referral is when people tell people. A person tells another person. That's the best lead that any kind of business can get. It's what I used to call nose-to-nose, toes-to-toes marketing. It's people telling people. And so I really pray that that's how this podcast has the opportunity to increase in influence. You know, I could try to spend a lot of money. My problem is I don't have the money to invest in marketing. We could buy billboards on the highway. We could put ads in the newspaper. We could go on the radio to try to promote the podcast so that people know about it. And all that is incredibly expensive. But people telling people isn't so expensive. It's like a spiritual grassroots movement, people telling people. So anyway, if you just consider, if you know a brother, if you hear about somebody struggling, just mention the podcast, and I trust that more people will hear about it so that more people can be helped and encouraged by it. And the second favor that I wanted to ask is if you would consider the possibility of writing a review of the podcast on iTunes. If you go to iTunes and you put in the search bar right there, Power of Purity, the Power of Purity podcast will pop up, and you click on the Power of Purity icon, and there's a little button there called Ratings and Reviews. And if you click on that, then you can just write a little review, whatever you want to say, and you rate the show from 1 to 5. And I promise you, I will seriously consider any input, any suggestions or ideas or ways that you think the show could be better. I want to make this just as excellent as it can be to help people and for the glory of God. So I'm open to input. I appreciate your comments, your encouragement. And the main reason that I ask for reviews is because the more reviews we get, the higher it pushes our podcast in the rankings on iTunes, and therefore it's easier and easier for more people to find it, and that's my primary interest. So it's not that big a deal. If you literally have 2 or 3 minutes, 5 minutes at the most, you could go there, write a little review, and it would really be helpful in the promotion of the podcast. So if you believe in our message, if you believe what we're trying to do, you can help. And that's what I'm asking for, so I really do appreciate it. Anyway, the title of my podcast today is entitled, Why You've Struggled So Much with Sex. And most of what I'm going to be talking about here actually is taken from a session in the Power of Purity podcast. But the content is so important, I thought I'd share some of it with you guys, and I hope it's encouraging. And if I had to give a thesis to this session, my thesis would be, when you understand the very unhealthy way that your sexuality developed, you'll understand why you've struggled so much with sex. I'll say that one more time. When you understand the very unhealthy way that your sexuality developed, you'll understand why you've struggled so much with sex. You know, in John chapter 10, verse 10, Jesus said, "The thief comes to steal, kill, and destroy." And without a doubt, the primary way that evil has literally attempted to destroy my life was through the sexual addiction that I struggled with for so many years. I can't tell you how deeply I struggled with the issue of sex, essentially for the first 40 years of my life. And for those of you that have heard my story, if you haven't heard it, you can go back. It's in the early episodes of the podcast. I review my story. But I tell you, I struggled and 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 struggled with the issue of sex. And then at the age of 16, I became a true born-again Christian. I understood who Jesus was. I understood what Jesus had done for me, that God loved me. He sent Christ to die for my sins. Jesus came back from the dead to prove that he is who he claims to be, and that if I would put my faith in Christ, that I would be saved. My sins would be forgiven. I'd become a child of God. I'd be born again. I'd have the assurance of eternal life. God would be in my heart and life to help me on the daily journey of life. So I became a believer when I was 16 years old. But even though I became a Christian, I still struggled and struggled and struggled and struggled and struggled and struggled with the issue of sex for years and years to come. And although I could say so much more about that, essentially, in a nutshell, I was really, really bad at resisting sexual temptation. I was really bad at controlling myself sexually. And whenever sexual temptation would come my way, which was very frequently, right, in this very wounded, broken, and fallen world in which we live, this very highly sexualized world in which we lived, we're surrounded by perpetual, constant, never-ending temptation and opportunity to act out. And it seems like whenever this opportunity would come around, I could not resist it. It seemed like I was powerless to resist sexual temptation. There was something about it that was more powerful to me. It's as if it was my master and I was the slave. It was the master, the potentate, and I was the servant, and I had to serve it. And I can't tell you how many times I thought to myself, Tony, what is wrong with you? Why can't you get this sex thing under control? And by the way, I always knew what was right and wrong. My problem was never, well, I didn't know that was wrong. I didn't know you're not supposed to do that. I always had a moral equilibrium, like a moral compass. I knew what was right and I knew what was wrong. And I didn't want to do the wrong thing. But more often than not, I would do the wrong thing, and I often acted out in violation of my very own conscience. And my sexual sins have included, among many other things, lust, pornography, compulsive masturbation, I visited strip clubs on occasion, fornication before I was married, several adulterous affairs after I was married. I've had a couple one-night stands with people who were essentially complete strangers to me. I had a sexual affair with my best friend's wife, who was also my wife's best friend at the time of the affair. And the bottom line is I've deeply hurt many people over the years because of my willingness to selfishly use them for the purpose of my own sexual addiction. And over the years, again, I can't tell you how many times that I acted out sexually in violation of my very own conscience. And that's kind of terrible if you think about it. When you're about to do something that you know you shouldn't do, and part of you doesn't want to do it, and I know God doesn't want me to do it, and I know that when I'm done, I'm going to feel terrible and shameful, and I'm going to wish that I wouldn't have done it. So my very own conscience is screaming at me, don't do this. Don't do this, Tony. And I still end up doing it. It's kind of uncool. I mean, it's just kind of really sad if you think about it. When a person acts out in violation of their very own conscience. And I would think to myself, Tony, what's wrong with you? Why can't you get this sex thing under control? Why can't you manage yourself sexually in a healthier way? Why do you always do the things that you shouldn't do? Why do you do things that you know God doesn't want you to do? And so on and on and on the struggle went. And in addition to my personal story, I can tell you as a pastor and a professional counselor, you see, for many years I thought I was a freak show. But I've come to learn that my struggle is rather common, and that so many people in this world, so many men have struggled and struggled and struggled and struggled and struggled and struggled and struggled with the issue of sex in their life. And it's my hope and prayer that many of these people who are struggling with this issue, and it's been overwhelming to them, and it's defeated their life, and they don't know where to get help and encouragement and some resources to help them in this struggle and battle, that's why we're doing this Power of Purity podcast. So it can be a resource where people can come and begin to get some encouragement and insight that will help them deal with this struggle in a better way than they ever have before. But there's a lot of men like me. They know what's right and wrong. They know what God wants them to do and what they shouldn't do. And yet they seem powerless to resist this sexual temptation that presents itself to them. And they act out sexually over and over again in violation of their very own conscience. So what's the deal? Why do so many men end up in this place of struggle and struggle and struggle with sex? Well, let me just say that if you're a man who can relate to this struggle, then this podcast episode is for you, and really the next couple podcasts, because I tend to be verbal, and my basic philosophy is why say in 100 words what you can say in 1,000 words. So when I start one of these episodes, I never quite know for sure how long it's going to take, but I suspect that we'll be on this topic here for at least the next couple episodes of the Power of Purity podcast. But in the context of this session, I'm going to share with you 10 reasons that you've struggled so much with sex in your life. I believe that we have some insights here that will be very helpful. And if you stay tuned for this episode and the next couple coming up on this topic, it's going to help you understand yourself better than you've ever understood yourself before. And we're going to get to them 10 principles here in just a few moments. But before I do, I want to share 2 concepts with you that'll kind of set the stage for us. And the first concept, I just want to talk a little bit about the concept of the birth of sexuality. Imagine, obviously, it's God's will that we are sexual people. sex was God's idea, right? God invented sex. He invented gender. It says in the book of Genesis, let us make man in our image, and God created them male and female. So I just want to talk a little bit about this concept of the birth of a boy's sexuality and how it was intended to come about. And if I had to pick one word to describe God's intention for this significant event in a boy's life, I'd pick the word innocence. God intended that a boy's sexuality would emerge in the context of innocence. God made us sexual creatures. That's a good and wonderful thing. And inevitably, the time comes in every person's life when they transition physically, you see, from a child to an adult, and they become capable of sexual/physical reproduction. Every boy's going to go through the metamorphosis from a boy to become a man, and every girl's going to go through the metamorphosis from a girl to become a woman. And the word for this transition, by the way, is the word puberty. And puberty is defined as the period during which an adolescent reaches sexual maturity and becomes capable of reproduction. And some years ago, Dr. James Dobson wrote a book called Bringing Up Boys. It was a really good book. And in that book, and I'm going by memory here, I read this book years ago, but he describes kind of an idealistic model of how puberty was intended to unfold in a boy's life. And although I'm not quoting him exactly, I'm just kind of trying to convey the picture that he was kind of creating. But basically, he's kind of describing this concept of innocence, how God intended a boy's sexual gift to be born and to grow, the process of puberty to occur in a context of innocence, you see. And so he describes how a boy's body begins to naturally change as it goes through this transition of purity, especially as testosterone begins to escalate in his physical body. He begins to have acne on his face. His voice begins to change. His voice is becoming deeper. He's beginning to grow hair on his body in places that he's never had hair before, like under his arms and on his face and on his chest and in his pubic area. He begins to gain muscle mass, and he begins to even have body odor. And inevitably, at some point, he begins to notice and then become interested in the opposite sex in a way that he's never noticed before. And of course, as this interest grows, he eventually becomes infatuated with a girl at school, probably junior high school. Let's say her name is Susie. And since he's completely shy and awkward, right, he has no idea what to do about this interest in Susie. So he eventually gets maybe one of his buddies to give Susie a note on the playground or something. And the note says something like, Billy likes Susie. Does Susie like Billy? Please check yes or no. Then months later, he ends up holding hands for a few brief moments with Susie at the junior high prom. And eventually, maybe he goes to the junior high football game, and at halftime, he ends up going to the concession stand with Susie, and then on the way back, they're underneath the grandstand, and he gets his very first kiss. And it amounts to really nothing more than maybe a very brief peck on the lips. But this whole picture, you see, is kind of our classic understanding of the concept of puppy love. The entire process is emerging and occurring, you see, with a kind of innocence. And innocence, by the way, is defined as a lack of guile, a lack of corruption, or purity. And with all that being said, as we're going to see in a moment, it's almost impossible in this day and age for a boy's sexuality to emerge in the context of innocence in the day and age in which we live. It's just virtually impossible, even though that's the way God intended it for most of us That's not the way it works. Well, I said I wanted to share 2 ideas with you to kind of set the stage. That's the first one, this concept of how a boy's sexual gift was intended to emerge in his life. The second one is an illustration I've shared before, but I'll just touch on it, and it's the cake illustration. The idea that when you make a cake, a lot of different ingredients go into the cake, right? Milk, flour, butter, egg, sugar, salt, baking powder, maybe flavoring, just to name a few. That's the first principle of the cake. The second principle of a cake is that the cake that comes out of the oven is predicated upon the ingredients that you put into the cake. You see, if you put good ingredients in the cake mix, then you're going to end up with a really, really good cake when it comes out of the oven. But if you put bad ingredients in the cake mix, you're going to end up with a really bad cake when it comes out of the oven. And can you imagine, for example, if there was an enemy who wanted to sabotage your cake, and so he somehow sneaks these really terrible, nasty ingredients into your cake mix before it goes into the oven. So he puts some gasoline in there, some urine, maybe some paint thinner, maybe some rat poison or lawn fertilizer. And in a case like that, of course, the cake that's going to come out of the oven is going to be a really bad cake, because the cake that comes out of the oven is predicated upon the ingredients that could put into the cake. And since so many terrible ingredients were put in the cake mix, you see, the cake that comes out is going to be terrible. And the point is this, you guys, I'd advocate that this principle of ingredients, this concept of ingredients, is just as true when it comes to the development of a person's sexuality, their sexual personhood, who they're going to become as a sexual person. Often, the way a person ends up practicing and experiencing their sexuality is predicated upon the ingredients that got mixed into their sexual cake mix during this period of puberty or this period of sexual development. And again, in this day and age, in the highly sexualized culture in which we live, there's almost, never-ending, ungodly, unholy, unhealthy, highly sexualized influences that a young person can be exposed to that's going to influence in negative and harmful ways their sexual development. So just for the fun of it, let's talk about this a minute. What are some of these ingredients? Let's just take an average boy in America. Doesn't matter which state he lives in, where he goes to school, just the average boy growing up in America. What are some of the ingredients that are typically getting mixed into the sexual cake mix of his adolescence during this period of puberty? He's 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. As he's going through this transition, what ingredients are getting put into the cake that rob him of his innocence? Well, the first one I think of course, is porn. And did you know that the average boy views pornography for the first time by the age of 11? And did you know that the biggest user of online pornography are 12 to 17-year-old boys? And I just want to say a couple things about this. I'm just kind of thinking out loud. I think it's tragic. I think it's overwhelming. I think it's monumental. I think it's unbelievably powerful and destructive in a boy's heart and life, and has profound influences concerning the development of his sexual self. Maybe here's a way to think of it. Imagine, I'm talking about this transition from boyhood to manhood, the transition through puberty. I'm picturing that at some point in a boy's heart and life, in his soul, his sexual self is being awakened as it should occur. That's God's plan. So imagine this tiny little flame. The fire represents his sexuality. So at some point there's a spark and a little flame, almost like if you struck a match, one little match. There's a little flame there, like a pilot light. And then as he goes through puberty, you see that flame very slowly is beginning to get a little bigger, a little bigger, a little bigger, as he's developing into his manhood. Well, in this metaphor, what I want to get to is this point. We all learn that you should not start a campfire with gasoline, right? Because gasoline is explosive. Could you imagine, even if you had a very small flame, just the size of a match, a very small flame, but you took a cup of gasoline or a gallon of gasoline and you threw it on that fire, it would explode. There would be this massive, unbelievable explosion that would be very harmful and dangerous. And I would liken pornography to the gasoline, because for most of these boys who are 10, 11, 12 years old, finding pornography for the first time at the age of 11 and 12 years old, and right there, as this little flame is being born in their soul, society comes, the culture in which we live comes and begins to dump gasoline right onto this emerging fire. And it has this explosive effect in people's lives. Just recently, I was talking to a young man, and he was telling me a little bit of his story, and he was telling me about his discovery of pornography. And of course, his parents have had no idea of this, but that he was looking at porn on a very regular basis. And this is true for virtually every boy. And I shared with you guys in my story how I found pornography when I was a boy. Of course, in that day and age, the internet wasn't born yet, so it was magazines and books, but nonetheless, it was just as powerful. And by the way, since we're on this topic of porn, I want to mention this one concept that I have. I get it. I mean, I understand why this is an overwhelming temptation that most guys simply cannot resist. And I have this metaphor, and I don't think I've shared it previously in the context of the podcast. If I did, please forgive me, because I teach and speak at different locations and I get confused. Did I say that? But anyway, imagine this. A guy goes to work, a man goes to work every day, and for some reason, there's a stack of pornographic magazines and books on his desk. Penthouse, Hustler, Playboy, just a stack of pornographic magazines. But he's a Christian man, right? So his conscience tells him, his moral equilibrium, his spirituality informs him, I better not look at that. I know I shouldn't look at that. God doesn't want me to look at that. If my wife found out, she'd probably be upset, so I'm not going to look. So he tries to resist looking at that pornography that's sitting on his desk. And maybe he makes it through the day. And if he's doing really good, maybe he makes it several days. Maybe weeks or even months are going by. But every day he's sitting there looking at that in the corner of his eye, and he's tempted to look. There's something in him, of course, that wants to sneak a peek. He wants to see that. And what I'm suggesting is that, just take the average guy. How long do you think it's going to be before he sneaks a peek and he starts looking at that pornography? If he's lucky, maybe he'll make it days, maybe he'll make it a couple weeks or a month or two. I don't know. But I would advocate that eventually what's going to happen is he's going to have a really, really bad day. He's going to have a fight with his wife. He's going to be mad at God. He's going to feel confused or depressed. And maybe he's in the place where he doesn't even care. He knows what's right or wrong, but I don't care. I'm going to do it anyway. And so he acts out and he indulges in this pornography. And you see, this is the situation we have in this day and age with internet pornography. It's like we all live our life with these devices, right? Our smartphones, our laptop computers. We have these devices, and we know that this pornography is literally 1 or 2 clicks away. It is always there. It never, ever goes away. And a guy knows this in the back of his mind, and he's perpetually tempted. Man, I better not look. I'm going to try not to look. And he's trying to resist it. But for so many of us, it just becomes an overwhelming temptation. And in a matter of time, many of us have given into this temptation, and then we're off and running, and the damage is done. Well, you guys, I just can't believe that 30 minutes has gone by this quickly. But it has, so I'm going to have to wrap up this episode today. I hope it's been a blessing to you, and I did not make as much progress as I hoped to make today. So please come back, tune in next week, and we're going to continue this important topic and help you understand why you've had such a huge struggle with your sexual self. We're going to get to these 10 principles, I think, that are going to help you understand you better than you ever have before. But God bless you guys. Have an awesome day. Thank you.
Thanks for listening. Visit powerofpurity.org for more resources and information. And if this podcast has been helpful or encouraging, please invite a friend to listen. Until next time, remember, there's power in purity.
The power of purity.